Hi, my name is Jack Rackham from the YouTube channel of the same name, and I am honored to present the only major dynasty we have not yet covered on this channel. This is the family tree of Georgian monarchs, the oldest Christian royal dynasty in the world. That's right, this Georgian dynasty is older than the English and Danish monarchies, and older than the French House of Capet, despite the fact that they stopped reigning more than 200 years ago. The people of this region have seen it all, standing between the Byzantines and the Persians, the Russians and the Ottomans. They fought against Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, Peter the Great, Roman emperors, Mongol Khans, and much more. Let's get started. The monarchs of Georgia go back a long time. If you look at the list on Wikipedia, you'll see a line of kings stretching all the way back to about 300 BCE, when there was a kingdom in the region called Iberia. But Georgia is located at an important crossroads, and for much of its classical history, often found itself caught in between the two much larger, much more powerful empires of the Romans and the Persians, meaning although the kingdom of Iberia had a king, it wasn't exactly independent. Sometimes Rome was more powerful and it controlled Georgia, and sometimes Persia was more powerful and it controlled Georgia. Our chart begins in the year 813. By that time, the Roman Empire was now the Eastern Roman Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, and Persia was now the Abbasid Caliphate. They had continued to fight for influence over Georgia throughout the centuries, and so they did once again around 813. This time, the Byzantines had taken control, and in order to stop the Abbasid Caliphate from taking Georgia back, the Byzantines put a new king in charge of Georgia named Ashot the Great. Ashot the Great became the first king of the Bagrationi dynasty. Up until the early 20th century, it was widely believed that this dynasty could trace its roots all the way back to the biblical King David, hence the reason why so many Georgian kings were named David. However, as with so many dynasties, this was likely just a myth created to boost their legitimacy. What's more likely is that they are somehow related to the similarly named Bagratuni dynasty from nearby Armenia. That dynasty can trace its roots all the way back to 301 AD, when Armenia became the first country in the world to make Christianity its official state religion. So it's quite likely that this Christian royal dynasty is over 1700 years old. As claims to fame go, that's not too bad. Anyway, around the same time as Ashot the Great, a king named Leon II gained independence for a nearby region called Abkhazia to the north. These two families were very closely tied. They often fought, but they often intermarried, and after many decades, that led to King Bagrat III inheriting lands from both sides of the family, making him the first ruler of a united Georgia. But even united, Georgia still faced many problems. Tensions were growing between Georgia and the Byzantine Empire. Some lands in Georgia were still ruled by Byzantines or Arabs, and the loyalty of many of the king's noblemen was questionable. That all changed in the rule of David the Builder. In Georgia's long history, David the Builder is considered one of its greatest monarchs. For years, the Georgian monarchs had been given their titles by the Byzantines, but David refused to accept their title, negotiating with the Byzantine emperor instead as equals. He regained more Georgian lands, capturing Tbilisi. He also drove out the Seljuks, an invading group of nomads that had conquered much of Central Asia. David the Builder began what's considered to be Georgia's Golden Age, which would last for several generations. Arts and culture flourished through the construction of magnificent churches. King David's son Demetrius was even a celebrated poet in his own right, whose hymns are still sung 900 years after his death. The zenith of Georgia's Golden Age arrived during the reign of its first queen, Tamar. named after the biblical Tamar, who was the wife of Judah and one of the ancestors of the biblical King David. The dynamic between the royal families of Georgia and the Byzantine Empire completely flipped when the Byzantine's capital was attacked by Western crusaders. The once mighty emperors found themselves turning to their former vassal for help. They sent their princes to be raised in Tamar's court, and Tamar helped to prop up a small kingdom for them to rule. Tamar won more victories for Georgia against the Ayyubids of Egypt and the Sultanate of Rum in modern-day Turkey, acquiring a strong influence not just over the Caucasus region, but over trade routes in the Black Sea as well. She even sponsored monasteries in Jerusalem. European writers in Jerusalem remarked that no one dared to get in the way of the fearsome Georgians, but at the same time, Tamar's policy was very progressive in abolishing the death penalty and torture. And of course, with the kingdom's abundant riches came more fine art. But after Tamar's death, an unexpected obstacle proved to be a far bigger disaster than any the kingdom had faced before. King George IV was preparing to engage in a crusade and spread his kingdom's influence when the Mongols attacked. George fought to defend his kingdom, but died to his wounds. His successor, Queen Rusudan, was chased across the mountain range into western Georgia. Eastern Georgia submitted to the Mongols, because all those who didn't were killed. Rusudan had sought help from Rome, knowing that the mountains would only protect her for so long, but it never came, and in 1243 she too had to submit to the Great Khan. The dynasty continued, however, and her successors fought back against the Mongols, but their many long and bloody uprisings turned out to be more devastating than the Mongol invasion itself. Within a few generations, however, the Mongol Empire fractured, and the pieces it left behind became weaker and weaker. George V, the Brilliant, once known as the Shadow King of Tbilisi, was able to escape the thumb of the Mongols and stop paying tribute. He rebooted diplomatic ties with the Byzantines, as well as the growing maritime powers of Europe. Once again, Georgia had monasteries in the Holy Land. It was as if the Golden Age had returned, but in fact, it was only a brief remission. After the Mongols came the Black Death, and after the Black Death came another conqueror from the family of Genghis Khan, named Timur. Bagrat V the Great resisted Timur's invasion, fighting to the end even though his nobles had abandoned him. Bagrat V was captured and forced to convert to Islam, but allowed to return to Georgia. When he did, he converted back to Christianity and ordered his army to kill the Timurid soldiers who brought him back. Timur was so angered, he invaded Georgia 8 more times. He never succeeded in conquering all of it, but nevertheless, the damage he caused was great. Alexander the Great of Georgia, not to be confused with the more famous Alexander the Great, was the last king who left behind a united and independent Georgia. During his reign, he had to contend with rebellious vassals, and to solve that issue, Alexander had named his sons as co-rulers in different parts of his kingdom. But when Alexander retired and his sons came of age, they soon began to war with one another, and this conflict persisted throughout the generations, dividing the family into these 3 main branches, represented here in red, blue, and yellow. All 3 of these branches were often highly dysfunctional. Let me give you a quick snapshot of what things looked like in the 1500s. Over here in the red branch, Simon I the Great of Kartli resisted the Persians in battle, but was captured. He came back 9 years later and fought as a Persian vassal against the Ottomans, resisting domination by one foreign power for the sake of being dominated by a second foreign power. George II of Imereti, in yellow, was caught in the middle of a civil war against his vassals, and Alexander II of Kakheti, in blue, was deposed by his son, came back to power a year later when his son died, only to be deposed in a second coup by his other son. Meanwhile, Georgia was once again caught between major powers. As I mentioned, the Persians and the Ottomans both had an interest in the region. In the early 1600s, the Persians alone came to dominate Georgia, but their influence was met with mixed reactions. In Tbilisi, citizens offered heavy resistance, and the Persians massacred 130,000 to 200,000 people. In the mid-1600s, there was an effort made to see if Russia might be able to help, but Georgia was so unstable that who Russia should negotiate with and how much of Georgia that person even controlled was constantly changing. These dire circumstances were captured by a French traveler who visited the region and noted, quote, "the wretchedness of the peasants, the arrogance of the nobles, and the ignorance of the clergy." Indeed, the first printing press in the Georgian script wouldn't be created until 1709. But, like all empires, the Safavid dynasty of Persia eventually fell, and something interesting happened when it did. Initially, influence over Georgia was contested between the Ottoman and the Russian empires, when all of a sudden, a man named Nader Shah, sometimes called the Napoleon of Persia or the Second Alexander, emerged out of Persia and created a brand new dynasty. But like Napoleon and Alexander the Great, his dynasty was short-lived and created a lot of instability. A very important king in Georgia named Heraclius II took advantage of that instability to recreate a united Georgia. First of all, he inherited two kingdoms and reunited eastern Georgia for the first time in centuries. Hence, the red and blue branches of this family tree disappear to create purple. Heraclius spent many decades seeking to counterbalance Persian influence with support from Russia. Although at first Russia wouldn't even give him the time of day, he was eventually granted a small military force with which to ward off the Persians and Ottomans, and in 1783 his kingdom was recognized as a Russian protectorate. What this meant for the Bagratiani family was that they were guaranteed to stay in power and to keep their lands, but they needed to go through Russia on matters of foreign diplomacy, and their successors would need to be approved by the Tsar. This big step forward was then, just 4 years later, followed by an equally large step backwards by the same king. In 1787, when Georgia and Russia were fighting the Ottoman Empire, Heraclius II exited the war before the Tsar of Russia, and without her permission. Since Heraclius had broken their agreement, the Russian forces protecting Georgia left, and a few years later, the Persians burned the capital of Tbilisi to the ground. That was followed shortly by another succession crisis, and of course, one of the candidates turned to Russia for support. After the Heraclius debacle, Russia would not accept mere influence in foreign policy in exchange, and so Georgia was fully incorporated into the Russian Empire, with the Bagratiani dynasty losing their status as kings after 1,000 years. However, they did continue to live as aristocrats in Russia. Some even served with notable distinction in the Imperial Army and later the Red Army. The head of this branch of the family is currently Nusgar Bagration Grzinsky. He is the last male member in this branch, so his heir is his daughter Anna, who is married to David, the head of the Mukrani branch in green. The Mukrani branch, which is the senior branch of the Bagratiani dynasty, is related to many royal families throughout Europe, including the Spanish Bourbons and the Habsburgs. But perhaps most interestingly, one of the members of this family married into the Russian royal family, years after they had been overthrown by the communists. So the current head of the Romanov family and heir to the imperial throne of Russia, the Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna, can trace her roots back all the way to the earliest monarchs of Georgia, more than 1,000 years ago. Finally, there is a third branch of the dynasty still in existence as well, the Yellow Imereti branch. It is currently led by Irakli Bagration Imeretinsky. And that concludes our look at the world's oldest Christian dynasty. We don't sell this particular chart, but you can download it for free using the link in the description or pinned comment. That's because this chart was created by a fan of the channel over on our popular subreddit r/usefulcharts, which you should check out as well. Thanks for watching.